Hey everybody, it's Rapid. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be having a discussion about some of the issues with close air support or CAS in the game of War Thunder. Now, in order to lay the groundwork for a discussion about the nature of CAS and some of the issues it has and also present solutions, we first have to lay a base groundwork for this discussion. As part of that groundwork, it's very important to understand the difference between something that is overpowered and something that is simply unfun or tedious to play against. If something in a game is overpowered, the answer is obviously to bring down the power level. However, if something is unfun or tedious to play against, the objective should be less to adjust the power level of that item and more to increase the amount of counterplay or agency the player has. Of course, that segues into another foundation that is needed for a discussion on CAS, and that is how powerful is CAS. And this is another fundamental problem with many of the discussions people try to have on this subject, is that CAS is not a single monolithic entity. That is to say, there isn't a single tech tree entry called CAS that you can spawn at any battle rating that universally has the same power level at every battle rating. When you say CAS, you're lumping in vehicles like the B-17, the Etendard, the Alouette, the BF-109, the Su-34, the Tu-4, the AJS-37, the Apache, the Typhoon, and even the Predator drone. This obviously highlights the problem because the only common feature that all of these vehicles have is that they fly in the air. The power level of these vehicles is all over the place. Some are underpowered, some are overpowered, some are perfectly fine, some are very much not. The power level of CAS sees fairly significant fluctuation throughout the game of War Thunder, not just in terms of individual vehicles, but also in terms of the battle ratings that you play them at and the types of weapons they have. This also segues into another foundation that is important to have when having this discussion, and that is the circle of counters. While a Tiger H1 has very little chance of surviving an encounter with an F4U 4B Corsair, a Skink also has very little chance of surviving an encounter with a Tiger H1. Of course, what I'm not saying with this concept of the circle of counters is that it always works well, and this will be one of the topics we're going to be looking at in this discussion point, is areas where the circle of counters falls apart. However, if a player is not engaging with the circle of counters at all, such as not including air or anti-air in their lineup, and then meets one of those counters and doesn't have a response to it, I don't think that's necessarily a failing of the game. You're given 3 crew slots base and also enough spawn points to spawn generally 2 medium tanks and an anti-air, even if you're getting 0 score, so the balance of the game is not reliant on you being able to defeat every possible enemy you run into with any possible vehicle you could spawn. Or to put that in simpler terms, there's a very big difference between the circle of counters not working, i.e. anti-air not effectively countering the air it can possibly meet, and a player not engaging with it, such as simply taking one premium vehicle or simply taking one vehicle with backups out to record content for a video. In that respect, the focus of this video is not going to be ways in which a medium tank can fight off aircraft on its own or reliably survive air attacks, but rather ways in which the circle of counters can be effectively maintained and reinforced so that there is always an option available to players that wish to engage with it. This leads us to our first point, and one that I am willing to admit may be more on me than the game itself, and that is the overall visibility of aircraft. As the game has gone heavier and heavier on things like lighting effects, weather effects, and particle effects, it has become increasingly difficult to identify what is a speck in the sky or a hostile aircraft. While this can definitely be an issue with fixed-wing aircraft such as props or jets in certain situations, I do find that helicopters tend to be a much bigger offender in this area, especially if the helicopter pilot actually knows what they're doing and doesn't just go straight up into the air from the helipad and actually tries to use terrain to their advantage. Trying to find these helicopters that are actively trying to hide from you both in anti-air and in aircraft is often like playing a game of Where's Waldo, but where Waldo randomly throws a missile at you if you don't find him fast enough. Hands down, my biggest complaint in this area though are the drones, specifically the Predators, the Orions, and the Wing Longs. These aircraft are virtually invisible and almost impossible to spot unless they're right on top of you. It's bad enough that these drones are generally immune to most IR SAMs as they have a very low infrared signature and are difficult to lock, and also most gun-based AA can't reliably touch them either, but even if you spawn in longer range radar-based missile AAs, if they are outside of your radar scan arc, it can often be excessively tedious to even figure out where the drone is, even though it is effectively just flying around in open sky. My proposed solution to this would actually be fairly simple and is already in the game for one specific type of aircraft. If you're familiar with the recon drones that light tanks can spawn, these are about the size of a lawnmower, and yet you can clearly see them from several kilometers away because the game artificially increases their silhouette to make sure players can actually spot these things instead of them simply being completely invisible. Of course, with all of that being said, I am perfectly willing to admit that this might simply be a me issue, maybe maybe I'm just completely blind, so feel free to let me know in the comments down below if you also find visibility of aircraft is frequently an issue for you as well. Of course, that neatly segues into our next issue, and that is that there is rarely enough anti-air on any given battlefield to fend off the air that you are called upon to fight. The lack of anti-air, in my opinion, can be attributed to two major factors. Number one, anti-air is very boring to play, and number two, the rewards for it are also very weak. While I could show you a montage of me getting kills in various anti-airs, what's going on behind you, which is a whole lot of nothing, is what you're going to be experiencing the vast majority of the time you're playing an anti-air. Just a whole lot of time waiting for the enemy to spawn in an aircraft and get close enough that you can actually shoot at them. On top of that, many anti-air in the game are not terribly versatile. The World War II era anti-air can often shred lighter opponents, however medium or heavy tanks are frequently outside of the range of what they can realistically kill, and as you go up in BRs and you start getting to more missile-based AAs, you'll start getting more and more vehicles that struggle to kill even the lightest of vehicles, and in some cases can't kill any ground vehicles at all. The game does give some of the more useless AAs the ability to use active scouting. However, if you have a vehicle like the one in front of you, the Gecko, that is the size of a bus and also handles like a bus, the odds of you using this with any degree of efficiency without just dying are pretty low. This also leads a bit into the anti-air paradox, that is to say, while a lot of anti-air can't effectively engage ground targets, there are some that can. However, when people spawn the anti-air that can effectively engage ground targets, they tend to spend a lot of their time going out and engaging ground targets, and while they're doing this, are not generally keeping an eye out for enemy aircraft. So broadly speaking, you could split anti-air into two main categories: anti-air that people don't like to spawn because they can't really do anything to ground targets, and anti-air that people do like to spawn because they can take out ground targets, however they don't usually end up functioning in the anti-air role. Of course, this also neatly segues into another issue that anti-airs frequently run into, and that is if two teammates spawn an anti-air, frequently one of them is going to be a lot better at shooting down planes than the other. And what this often translates to is one of the anti-air really doesn't get to do much while the other one cleans up all the kills. And given that the average map only has about 4 to 5 enemy aircraft to take out, this is really not a lot of RP for either player. Speaking of RP, given that the average CAS plane costs between 500 to 600 spawn points, you get remarkably little in terms of rewards for shooting one down. This really doesn't combine well with the low numbers of CAS planes typically present in any given map, and also the number of teammates that you will be fighting with for those kills. This combination of factors frequently results in teams, even ones that do have effective anti-air available at a battle rating, usually having very anemic anti-aircraft umbrellas relative to what they could potentially field. As far as potential solutions, this is also one of the more difficult problems to truly solve. The only way to add enough vehicles for every anti-air to potentially have something to do would be for the computer to artificially spawn aircraft, which I think would upset a lot of people. Additionally, increasing the reward modifier isn't exactly a perfect solution either, because it doesn't solve the problem that anti-air frequently don't contribute all that much to their team's success on the ground, so you could also potentially lead into scenarios where half the team is sitting in spawn trying to kill aircraft if you increase the rewards too high. After mulling this over a bit, the best solution I really came up with was a way for players to swap to an anti-air, perhaps limiting it to a once per match deal. The big problem with trying to go from your normal ground vehicle to an anti-air is obviously that you basically lose your ground vehicle. You have to destroy it, which means you're not only dropping some tickets from your team, you're losing a spawn just to go into an anti-air that you might only need to counter 1, maybe 2 enemy planes, which obviously is probably not going to be worth it in a lot of situations. So the ability to more freely switch to an anti-air at least once per match and then go back to your normal vehicle might be a potential solution, although this is one of the areas where I would like to hear more from the audience as to what you guys think would really create a solution to people simply not wanting to play anti-air. The next issue that compounds the CAS problem is players simply not having anti-air available to them. These are often players who go up with squadron vehicles or premium vehicles, and in my opinion this wouldn't really be that much of an issue except for the fact that the game does insist on giving both teams free drones once you get up to a certain battle rating. What this functionally means is that the game is guaranteeing that every player on both teams will have access to a moderately functional aircraft, but isn't taking steps to make sure that all players on both teams have access to moderately functional AA. If the game is going to keep things like Predator drones, Orions, and Wing Longs in the game should also hand out players anti-airs to at least offer them some means to counter some of the aircraft they're likely to see. My proposal to this would be relatively simple. Based on the battle rating that you're playing at, you would get a rental anti-air. These wouldn't necessarily be the best anti-air, and the rewards for them would be fairly low to try to encourage you to actually get your own anti-air, but it would at least be better than nothing. To use an example, and obviously something like this would have to go through some testing and modification before being implemented. Let's say, for example, if you have an 8.0 to 9.0 vehicle, but you don't have at least a rank 5 vehicle in the tech tree, the game would automatically add something like an M163 to your lineups that you would have at least an anti-air. Additionally, if you went to a 9.3 or higher battle rating and didn't have at least a rank 6 vehicle, you would get access to something like the French Roll-in-1 anti-air. Neither of these two anti-airs would be what you would call the best for their battle rating. They're both fairly modest in terms of their capabilities, but they are significantly better than some 50 cals mounted on the back of a truck for dealing with helicopters with guided missiles and planes with guided bombs. And of course, as soon as you get up to a rank where you could conceivably get your own anti-air that is capable of dealing with these threats, the game would stop adding these to your lineups. The next issue we're going to discuss is one that doesn't come up all that often, but is absolutely infuriating when it does, and this is when one team has no ground vehicles left in the match. If a team has no ground vehicles left in the match, but they do have some aircraft up, the game will keep the match going, and this is kind of a problem because as a player, your objective are to secure the objectives and to kill the enemy. If you're in a medium tank, how do you do that when all of the enemy are in aircraft and you've already secured the objectives? There's really nothing for the average player in this match to do other than wait for the time to tick down. To top it off, you could easily be waiting 1 or several minutes depending on exactly when this occurred in the match and exactly how many tickets both sides had left at the time. In the match in the background, there are 3 enemies left, and I was counting as the kill feed went out, all 3 of those enemies were in Orion drones. There was literally nothing our team could do to interact with them in a meaningful way other than try to spawn anti-air, and this also creates a problem with the drone itself since the drone has a very low infrared signature. Even if we had spawned anti-air, if we had spawned anti-air with infrared seekers, we probably couldn't have taken out the drones before they shot us. In this scenario, the only thing my team could do was simply wait and hope that the enemy didn't get enough kills to bleed our last tickets before the game was over. That being said, while losing a game to an enemy team entirely in aircraft is somewhat infuriating, winning a game against a team entirely in aircraft is just monumentally boring. There is nothing to do. There's maybe 2 or 3 enemies left, you still have a 10-man team and control of all of the objectives. At that point, the game is essentially a foregone conclusion. You already know who's going to win, you're just waiting for the timer to tick down, and the enemy team that is entirely in aircraft are just getting an opportunity with a shooting gallery of your team to get as many points as possible. And this seems a little unfair. Your team has gone to the effort of getting all of the objectives, you have wiped out the enemy on the ground. Why is the enemy being rewarded with several minutes and a free shooting gallery to rack up as many points as they can? While I do feel some players can go overboard in terms of their thoughts on the use of aircraft in a ground RB match, I don't think it's at all unreasonable to say that if your team cannot be asked to get in a single ground vehicle in a ground match, that you should lose that game. The solution to this would be fairly simple. If at any point one team has no ground vehicles on the ground battlefield, it will immediately start a timer, and after that timer has expired, it will start massive ticket bleed that will end the game fairly quickly. As a few notes about this, I do think that players should be given an opportunity to hop back into a ground vehicle, so they should at least receive enough time to do that before the timer expires. And also, I would want the game to make an exception for nuclear bombers. If somebody on one team has earned a nuke, they should at least get the opportunity to attempt to drop it before the timer starts burning down. Now, this is going to be the end of this particular installment, but I knew when I was setting out to do this that this was going to be a multi-part series looking at a bunch of different problems, and the next part of it will be a fairly in-depth look at spawn costs and how spawn costs can be adjusted to make the aircraft costing more fair. In that respect, if you haven't already looked at my guide on how aircraft spawn costs are calculated in a ground RB match, I would highly recommend checking it out because I will be referencing that quite a bit in the next episode. Of course, if you have any suggestions about issues that aircraft raise in ground RB matches, I would be more than happy to hear them in the comments and may even address them in one of the future installments. Just drop them down below. And that concludes this particular installment in the series. I am planning on making these to where I can simply stitch them together in a supercut and release one larger video later, so keep an eye out for that. If you did like the video, like and subscribe always helps out the channel. Comments are always appreciated as well. As always, danke bitte, tschüss.